NATO was never just about tanks. It was about risk, about whether investors would rebuild factories in bombed-out cities, about whether currencies would stabilize or collapse again, about whether Western Europe would drift toward political extremism under the weight of hunger, unemployment, and fear. And here's the part most people miss. Before NATO was a military alliance, it was an economic guarantee. Welcome to the financial historian, where money, power, and history collide. And nothing is ever as simple as it looks. When people think of NATO, they picture Article 5, collective defense, troops stationed along borders, and the Cold War standoff between East and West. They think of deterrence, missiles, and strategy rooms with maps on the wall. But by the time NATO was formally established in April 1949, Europe's most urgent threat wasn't a Soviet tank column rolling across the Rhine. It was economic collapse. The Second World War had left Western Europe physically shattered and financially fragile. Entire cities were reduced to rubble. Industrial output in countries like France and Italy had plummeted. Germany's economy had been dismantled. Transportation networks were broken. Food shortages were widespread. Currencies were unstable. Political movements were radicalizing. The memory of the Great Depression was not academic. It was lived experience. In the 1930s, financial collapse had paved the way for extremism. Mass unemployment had fueled resentment. Protectionism had fractured trade. And that economic breakdown had spiraled into war. Policymakers in Washington, London, and Paris were not guessing at what instability looked like. They had just survived it. By 1947, the United States faced a clear calculation. Western Europe was too weak to recover on its own, but too important to lose. Communist parties were gaining traction in France and Italy. The Soviet Union was consolidating influence in Eastern Europe. And without economic stabilization, political alignment was uncertain. So in June 1947, U.S. Secretary of State George Marshall announced what became known as the Marshall Plan, a massive program of economic aid aimed at rebuilding Western Europe. Between 1948 and 1952, the United States transferred roughly $13 billion, equivalent to over $150 billion in today's dollars, in grants, loans, food, fuel, and industrial equipment. But the Marshall Plan was not charity. It was strategy. And economic recovery would prevent political radicalization, political stability would prevent Soviet expansion, and a stable Western Europe would become a reliable trading partner and ally within a dollar-centered global financial system. Money and power were moving together, yet there was a problem no shipment of grain or steel could fix. Investors do not build factories in places they believe might be invaded next year. Capital requires predictability. It requires assurance that borders will hold and governments will endure. Reconstruction without security is a gamble. And in 1948, Western Europe still looked like a risk. The Berlin blockade that year made the stakes unmistakable. When the Soviet Union cut off land access to West Berlin, it wasn't just a geopolitical maneuver. It was a reminder that Europe's future was still contested. The United States responded with the Berlin airlift, supplying the city by air for nearly a year. It was a logistical triumph. But airlifts are not long-term economic policy. It showed that economic recovery could be undone overnight by strategic uncertainty. This is the context in which NATO emerged. On April 4th, 1949, 12 nations signed the North Atlantic Treaty. Article 5 declared that an attack on one member would be treated as an attack on all. It was framed as a military commitment. But economically, it did something profound. It reduced the probability of catastrophic disruption. That reduction in perceived risk mattered more than any shipment of steel. Security lowered uncertainty. Lower uncertainty attracted capital. Capital rebuilt industry. Industry reinforced political stability. NATO did not rebuild Europe directly. It made rebuilding investable. In the early 1950s, Western Europe's growth accelerated. Industrial production rebounded. Trade expanded. Living standards began to rise. This period, often called the economic miracle, in countries like West Germany, did not occur in a vacuum. It occurred within a structure where military security and economic integration reinforced each other. The United States provided not only money through the Marshall Plan, but also a security umbrella through NATO. That umbrella allowed European governments to prioritize reconstruction over defense spending. Instead of rebuilding large standing armies, they rebuilt industries, infrastructure, and social safety nets. But this was not a one-sided arrangement. The United States was not underwriting Europe out of charity. The alliance delivered structural returns to Washington that were strategic, financial, and enduring. By tying Western Europe's security to American power, the United States entrenched the dollar at the center of global trade. Under the Bretton Woods system, currencies were pegged to the dollar, and the dollar was convertible to gold. But that monetary architecture depended on trust. Trust that the Western Bloc would remain aligned and stable. NATO reinforced that trust. A secure Europe was more likely to trade in dollars, more likely to integrate economically under American influence, more likely to recycle capital through U.S. financial markets. Stability abroad supported dollar dominance at home. At the same time, NATO gave the United States forward military positioning across the Atlantic. Bases in Germany, the United Kingdom, Italy, and elsewhere extended American strategic reach. Defending Europe from within Europe is cheaper and more effective than projecting power from thousands of miles away. The alliance converted American military strength into geopolitical leverage and economic influence. Nothing stabilizes a currency quite like a global security footprint. As Western Europe rebuilt, it became not only a political ally, but a vast export market. American goods, machinery, and capital flowed outward. European growth created solvent consumers. The Marshall Plan did not merely transfer money, it created customers. Prosperous allies buy more than impoverished ones. This is where the story becomes more nuanced than the usual Cold War narrative. NATO was not simply about containing Soviet tanks. It was about preventing economic instability from creating political openings. It was about lowering the risk premium on democracy in Western Europe and positioning the United States at the lead. And that distinction matters. Because alliances built on economic stabilization behave differently from alliances built solely for war. They shape trade flows, they influence fiscal decisions, they alter investment patterns. They determine who feels secure enough to take risks and who does not. Behind closed doors, policymakers understood that markets and military commitments were intertwined. A defense guarantee reassured bond markets. A stable currency encouraged cross-border trade. A predictable geopolitical environment reduced the odds of capital flight. Security became an economic asset. By the mid-1950s, the Western Bloc had not only stabilized, but begun integrating economically through institutions like the European Coal and Steel Community, the precursor to the European Union. Economic cooperation reduced the likelihood of intra-European conflict. NATO reduced the likelihood of external aggression. Together, they formed a reinforcing loop. But loops create dependencies. As Western Europe relied more heavily on the American security umbrella, defense burdens became uneven. As capital flowed within a secure zone, economic growth became tied to political alignment. And as the Cold War intensified, NATO's military dimension expanded, but its economic foundation remained critical. This dual character, military and economic, shaped the alliance's evolution. To understand NATO only as a defense pact is to miss half the architecture. It was a system designed to lock in stability, align incentives, and protect a particular economic order. It lowered the cost of capital in member states. It encouraged integration under a US-led framework. It reassured markets that geopolitical fragmentation would not return as it had in the 1930s. But systems built for stability do more than deter enemies. They shape behavior. And once economic confidence becomes intertwined with military commitments, disentangling them becomes complicated. Because at that point, NATO isn't just about defense. It's about the credibility of the entire Western financial system. And that realization that military alliances can double as economic scaffolding is where the deeper story begins. Once NATO was in place, the Western alliance did more than coordinate troop deployments. It coordinated expectations. And expectations are the quiet engine of markets. In the 1950s and 1960s, the United States accounted for roughly half of global industrial output. The dollar, backed by gold under the Bretton Woods system, functioned as the anchor of international trade. Western Europe, under the protection of NATO, rebuilt rapidly and integrated economically. The pieces fit together. The result was a secure economic zone where trade expanded, cross-border investment increased, and supply chains deepened. Western Europe became not just a military ally, but an economic partner within a US-centered financial order. The dollar's dominance wasn't sustained by force alone. It was sustained by trust in a system that appeared cohesive and durable. But cohesion comes with trade-offs. By the late 1960s, the cost of maintaining global security commitments began to strain the American balance sheet. The Vietnam War, combined with domestic spending and rising international dollar liabilities, put pressure on U.S. gold reserves. In 1971, President Richard Nixon suspended the convertibility of the dollar into gold, effectively ending the Bretton Woods system. The gold window closed, the dollar floated, the world adjusted. Yet NATO did not unravel. The security framework remained intact, and that mattered. Even as currencies floated and financial markets became more flexible, the transatlantic security commitment provided a baseline of predictability. The alliance continued to signal that the Western Bloc would remain aligned. That signal supported continued integration, economically as well as militarily. It is difficult to overstate how important perception is in finance. A bond market reacts not only to debt levels, but to political stability. A currency reflects not only trade balances, but confidence in governance. NATO, by projecting unity, reinforced the idea that the Western system was durable, even when its monetary foundations shifted. Meanwhile, European integration accelerated. The European economic community expanded. Trade barriers fell. Eventually, the European Union emerged, followed by the euro. None of this occurred in isolation. Economic integration was easier to pursue under a shared security umbrella. Member states could focus on markets rather than mutual suspicion. Security reduced internal friction, and reduced friction lowered transaction costs, economically and politically. That is the economic architecture of NATO in action. During the Cold War, this arrangement seemed self-evident. The Soviet Union represented a clear external threat. The Western Bloc aligned accordingly. But when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, many observers assumed NATO's relevance would fade. If the enemy disappeared, what justified the alliance? Yet NATO expanded. Former Warsaw Pact countries joined. The alliance moved eastward, and even without a monolithic adversary, its existence continued to shape capital flows, defense procurement, and political alignment. Why? Because by then, NATO was no longer just a response to a specific threat. It was embedded in the operating system of the Western financial and political order. Membership signaled political alignment, regulatory predictability, and lower geopolitical risk. Investors priced that in. Countries inside the alliance benefited from lower risk premiums. Borrowing costs reflected not only fiscal metrics, but strategic positioning. Markets interpreted NATO membership as a signal of durability. Security became an economic credential. This doesn't mean NATO controlled markets directly. It means markets incorporated NATO membership into their assessment of risk. Countries inside the alliance were perceived as more stable than those outside it. Lower perceived risk translated into lower borrowing costs, higher investment, and deeper integration. Nothing reduces a country's risk premium like being seen as part of a powerful club. At the same time, this arrangement created asymmetries. The United States continued to shoulder a disproportionate share of defense spending, a price to pay to anchor an entire economic bloc aligned with its own financial system. European countries, benefiting from the security umbrella, allocated more resources to domestic welfare and economic development. That imbalance periodically triggered political friction. But friction within a stable framework is different from fragmentation. The deeper issue, especially in the 21st century, is that NATO's economic dimension has become harder to separate from global geopolitics. Energy supply chains, semiconductor production, shipping lanes, and cyber infrastructure are not purely military concerns. They are economic arteries. When tensions rise along NATO's eastern flank, markets respond. Energy prices fluctuate, defense stocks surge, government budgets adjust. Inflationary pressures ripple outward. The line between military alliance and economic architecture blurs. In 2026, this interconnectedness is impossible to ignore. Debates over defense spending are not only about tanks and aircraft. They are about fiscal priorities in an era of high debt and persistent inflation. Questions about burden sharing are not merely strategic, they are financial. A government that increases military spending must either raise taxes, cut programs, or borrow more. Each choice carries economic consequences. Meanwhile, geopolitical risk feeds directly into markets. Supply chain disruptions, sanctions, and regional conflicts influence commodity prices and investor sentiment. When NATO members coordinate sanctions or security responses, they are shaping global trade flows as much as military positioning. This is why understanding NATO purely through a military lens is incomplete. If security lowers uncertainty, and uncertainty influences capital, then NATO's health affects markets. If alliance cohesion wavers, risk premiums adjust. If commitments are questioned, currencies and bond yields react. The economic dimension is not a side effect, it is embedded. Consider energy. For decades, Western Europe relied heavily on Russian natural gas. When that dependency collided with geopolitical tensions, energy prices surged. Governments scrambled to diversify supply. Defense and energy policy became intertwined. Inflation followed. Households felt the impact not through troop movements, but through utility bills. Money and power intersect in subtle ways. An alliance that stabilizes borders also stabilizes trade. An alliance that deters aggression also shapes energy corridors and infrastructure investment. When NATO expanded eastward, it did more than move a defensive line. It reoriented economic expectations for entire regions. This doesn't make NATO benevolent or malevolent. It makes it structural. And structures endure. The central insight here is not that NATO secretly controls the global economy. It is that economic systems depend on predictable security frameworks. The Western financial order, from Bretton Woods to the present, has been intertwined with the assumption of transatlantic stability. Remove that assumption, and markets would need to reprice risk. That repricing would not happen in speeches. It would happen in bond yields, exchange rates, and investment decisions. It would manifest as higher borrowing costs, lower growth expectations, and heightened volatility. Security commitments influence spreadsheets. This is where the present becomes relevant. In an era of rising debt, demographic pressure, and geopolitical competition, alliances face new strains. Defense budgets increase, public finances tighten, political movements question long-standing commitments. Markets watch closely. The temptation is to frame these debates in ideological terms. But the deeper layer is economic. Alliances like NATO shape the environment in which capital moves. They influence whether investors perceive a region as cohesive or fragmented. History offers a pattern. Economic instability often precedes political fracture. After the First World War, financial chaos and protectionism fractured Europe. After the Second World War, coordinated security and economic reconstruction produced stability. NATO emerged from that lesson. It was built on the understanding that security is not merely a military condition. It is an economic one. And that brings us to the final reflection. Alliances are not just about who you defend. They are about what kind of economic order you sustain. NATO was born from fear of economic collapse as much as fear of invasion. It bound together markets and militaries, dollars and defense commitments. It reduced uncertainty long enough for a new economic system to take root. Understanding that doesn't tell you what position to take in modern debates. It tells you what's at stake beneath them. When people argue about NATO in 2026, they are arguing about budgets, borders, and strategy. But they are also, whether they realize it or not, arguing about the architecture that underpins transatlantic markets and financial stability. History doesn't repeat, but incentives remain consistent. Security lowers risk. Lower risk attracts capital. Capital builds systems. Systems create dependencies. And once money and power intertwine, separating them is rarely simple.